Welcome to the Pressure Room. I'm Elisa Verhel, Executive Leadership Coach, speaker, author, and founder of the Flamekeeper Institute. This podcast exists for the leaders who look successful on the outside but feel exhausted underneath it all. Here we'll talk about leadership, identity, resilience, reinvention, and the hidden cost of becoming hyper capable. Because eventually the pressure reveals something most people never see. Not who you are when everything is easy, but who you become when everything feels impossible. If you've ever wondered whether there's more to life than carrying everyone else's expectations, you're in the right room. Welcome to the Pressure Room.
The exhaustion no one talks about. Welcome to the very first episode of The Pressure Room. I'm Elisa Verhill, and before we go any further, I want to ask you a question. What if the very thing that made you successful is also the thing that's exhausting you? Think about it for a moment. What if the habits, beliefs, coping mechanisms, and survival strategies that helped you get where you are today are the very things preventing you from becoming who you're meant to be next? Because that's a question I never thought to ask myself. Not when I was building my career, not when I was achieving goals, not when I was checking all the boxes of what success was supposed to look like, and certainly not when everyone around me thought I was doing just fine. But eventually, life has a way of asking the questions we refuse to ask ourselves. And that's exactly what happened to me. This podcast exists because of that moment, not because I wanted to start a podcast, not because the world needed another leadership show. Lord knows there are enough of those already. This podcast exists because I became fascinated by a pattern I kept seeing over and over again in executives, in leaders, in entrepreneurs, in healthcare professionals, in parents, in high achievers, and eventually in myself. The pattern was simple. The people who looked the strongest were often the most exhausted. The people who looked the most successful were often the most disconnected. The people who looked the most capable were carrying the heaviest burdens. Yet almost nobody was talking about it. Instead, we called it stress, burnout, overwhelm, work life balance. But I began to believe something deeper was happening. I believe there's an exhaustion that comes from carrying an identity that no longer fits, an exhaustion that comes from becoming who everyone else needs you to be, an exhaustion that comes from forgetting who you are underneath the responsibilities, expectations, and pressure. I call it identity exhaustion. And if you've ever felt exhausted, even when things are technically going well, you may know exactly what I'm talking about. You see, I didn't grow up dreaming of becoming an executive coach. I grew up on a farm in Arkansas. My childhood was filled with hard work, responsibility, and figuring things out. If something broke, you fixed it. If work needed to be done, you did it. If life got hard, you didn't sit around talking about it. You found a way through it. Those lessons became part of who I was. And honestly, they served me well. They helped me become the first person in my family to graduate from college. They helped me build a successful corporate career. They helped me lead teams, navigate challenges, and create opportunities I once thought were impossible. Those lessons taught me resilience, but they also taught me something else. They taught me that my value came from what I could do, not who I was, what I could accomplish, what I could fix, what I could carry, what I could survive. And because I was good at those things, people depended on me. Maybe you know what that's like. Maybe you're the person everyone calls, the person everyone relies on, the person who always figures it out, the person who carries the team, the person who keeps the family together, the person who solves the problems, the person who never drops the ball. At first, it feels good. It feels meaningful. It feels rewarding until one day you realize you've become trapped inside your own competence. Because here's the danger of being highly capable. The more capable you become, the more people expect from you. And the more people expect from you, the more difficult it becomes to admit you're struggling. Because strong people aren't supposed to struggle. At least that's the lie many of us begin to believe. I know I did. For years, capability became my identity. I wasn't valuable because I existed. I was valuable because I was useful. And that's a dangerous bargain because eventually life will hand you something you cannot solve, something you cannot organize, something you cannot outwork, something you cannot control. And when that moment arrives, you discover who you really are. Or perhaps more accurately, you discover who you are not. For me, that moment came through a serious health diagnosis. The details aren't as important as what happened next. What mattered was this. For the first time in my life, I couldn't perform my way through the situation. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't control it. I couldn't manage it. I couldn't work harder and make it disappear. I was forced to sit still, and that was terrifying. Not because of the diagnosis, because of the silence. Because when the doing stopped, I was left alone with myself. And I realized I didn't know who I was without achievement. I didn't know who I was without responsibility. I didn't know who I was without being needed. And that realization hit me harder than anything else. I remember asking myself a question. If I can no longer perform, who am I? If I can no longer produce, who am I? If I can no longer take care of everyone else, who am I? Not what title do I hold, not what accomplishments have I achieved. Who am I? And the truth was, I didn't know because somewhere along the way, I had confused my worth with my usefulness. I had confused being loved with being needed. I had confused achievement with identity. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. But here's the beautiful thing. Awareness creates possibility because once I realized what was happening, I could begin asking better questions, questions that changed my life. What do I actually want? What matters to me? What am I carrying that isn't mine to carry? What expectations am I trying to live up to? Who am I beneath the performance? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what if success isn't about becoming more? What if it's about remembering who you've always been? That question became the foundation for everything that followed. It became the foundation of the Flamekeeper Institute. It became the foundation of my coaching work. And now it becomes the foundation of this podcast. Because I believe many people are living lives that look successful, but don't feel aligned. They're performing, they're producing, they're surviving, but they're disconnected from themselves. And here's what makes this difficult. The world rewards survival. The world rewards performance. The world rewards achievement. But eventually, your soul asks a different question. At what cost? At what cost are you achieving? At what cost are you succeeding? At what cost are you proving yourself? At what cost are you carrying everyone else's expectations? Because eventually there comes a moment when achieving more no longer solves the problem. Because the problem was never a lack of achievement. The problem was disconnection. Disconnection from yourself, disconnection from your values, disconnection from your truth, disconnection from the person you were before the world told you who you needed to become. That's why the pressure room is different. It isn't a podcast about productivity. It isn't a podcast about hustle. This isn't a podcast about becoming a better machine. This is a podcast about becoming more human. This is a podcast about leadership, identity, courage, resilience, reinvention, and truth. This is a podcast for people who are tired of performing their lives and ready to start living them. And over the coming weeks, we're going to have conversations that most people avoid. We're going to talk about burnout, career transitions, relationships, boundaries, people pleasing, identity, purpose, grief, growth, and what it means to create a life that feels as good on the inside as it looks on the outside. But before we close today's episode, I want to leave you with one question. And I don't want you to answer it quickly. I want you to sit with it. Maybe later tonight, maybe during a walk, maybe while you're driving home. Here's the question. If nobody needed anything from you tomorrow, who would you be? Not what would you do, who would you be? Because somewhere inside the answer to that question is the person you've been searching for. The person beneath the pressure, the person beneath the expectations, the person beneath the performance, the real you. And that is where our journey begins. Thank you for joining me for the very first episode of The Pressure Room. If this conversation resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's carrying more than they admit, someone who's always strong, someone who's always holding everything together. Because chances are they're exhausted too. Until next time, protect your flame, honor your truth, and never forget who you are. I'm Elisa Verhill, and this is The Pressure Room, where pressure reveals purpose and leaders remember who they are. Thank you for spending this time with me in The Pressure Room. If today's conversation challenged your thinking, strengthened your perspective, or helped you reconnect with what matters most, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs it. And remember, the pressure you're feeling today is not always a sign that you're breaking. Sometimes it's a sign that you're growing. Sometimes it's a sign that you're being called into a new level of leadership, courage, and purpose. Protect your flame. Honor your values. Lead with intention. And never forget who you are. Until next time, I'm Elisa Verhill. Thank you for joining me in The Pressure Room, where pressure reveals purpose and leaders remember who they are.